plants, a lot of love, and a steady supply of clean water. 30 years veteran of film and TV, David draws on his past to spread the story of the native habitat movement far and wide. The Wild Yards Project combines storytelling, public outreach, community gardens, and consultation to help retrofit biodiverse habitat into urban and suburban spaces. And then this is my favorite sentence, honestly. David believes madly, deeply in story, especially the ones that change the world. So over to you, David.
Thank you, Orchid. Yeah, well, isn't that the sort of fundamental, or like all religions, all are created in words. Worlds are created in words, and I think that's what we're doing. You know, we're pitching the creation of a new world, one that'll help us move through the one we've created. Anyway, I want Orchid and Cliff and Margaret and Barbara, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm nervous. I'm actually very nervous because there's a lot of people on this who are the people that I went to when I was trying to learn about all this stuff. So many of my teachers are people that I'm talking to right now, and I have a lot of humility and gratitude for that. I'm not a horticulturalist. I'm not a botanist. I was never even much of a landscaper, and I'm not a landscaper. Let me rephrase that. I'm not a landscaper. I'm a dad who loves the outdoors and loves nature, and who, you know, came upon this kind of very simply. I like this opening quote by Thomas Rainier, the new perennialist. I put it at the head of every talk I give because I think it's a very organizing principle. And the next renaissance of human culture will be the reconstruction of our natural world in our cities. And plants will be at the center of it all. And that idea, made scalable and made adaptable for everyone, is, to me, the most exciting thing that I can think of. That's the idea that gets me out of bed and keeps me up at night thinking. Because it's upon us to retrofit wildness into our urban and suburban civilized world. We've displaced too much of it, but we have a phenomenal opportunity. We have a monumental task ahead and a beautiful opportunity. So I'll do a little bit about me and how I got into all this, and then we'll move forward and we'll blow it out into other ways that I think this applies, and maybe it'll tap into something you're thinking about. What I'm really interested in is getting a conversation going. What I really want to do is crack open like some part of everybody's head for how they see themselves in this, and how we all move forward. So individually and together. So that's what my talk is about. So I grew up in New Jersey. Rampant post-war development after World War II. They were just putting in suburbs, displacing farmland and secondary and tertiary forests as fast as they could. But my neighborhood was all these new rampant developments, blocked off from areas that were soon to be developed by chain link fence. And over those fences were woods, sometimes dilapidated farms, sometimes big stands of maples and oaks and elms and all that kind of thing. So I had a very beautiful baseline experience growing up in New Jersey, which most people wouldn't really think of it as the wilderness capital of the world, but it was for me. And I could jump over those fences, and I could jump down into creeks, and I could chase pickerel frogs and wood frogs and salamanders. And my favorite thing to find was always box turtles. This is a male eastern box turtle. And they were everywhere when I was a kid. They were very easy to find, and I love them so much. They are, of course, now, I don't know if they're legally endangered, but they're at risk. Most of those areas have been developed. But for me, that experience of a kid growing up with a baseline experience of nature that was very high, it made a giant impression on me. Cut to many decades later, and I'm married, and my wife is pregnant with our first kid. And so the first thing you got to do is you got to buy a house. So we bought a house. And I want to take a minute here to just really focus on the curb appeal of that garden back when we bought it back in 2014. That's what sold it for us. And the house soon had these two guys, these two jokers. And having a house in a city, not very close to a busy street, in the middle of all this, which as you can see is there's not a lot of wildlife. There's not a lot of opportunities for wildlife here. But having two small children, and here's my house right there, in the middle of all this, I literally began to have anxiety attacks over trying to imagine what experience of wildness they would have. And granted, we live in the beautiful embrace of the Mediterranean chaparral here in Northeast LA, but that's not our backyard. And for most kids, that's not the experience that's going to really imprint on their DNA. What's going to imprint in their DNA is this. It's all this. And the school they walk to over here, that's going to become the bulk of their life. So I had a lot of anxiety about what baseline understanding and passion for and empathy for nature my kids were going to have. So there it is. There's the backyard. There were certainly no box turtles to be found in this backyard. I would later learn that there are slender salamanders deep, deep, deep underground, lungless salamanders waiting for someone to give them the opportunity to come up. But it was pretty sparse. It was pretty dry. It was pretty vacant and sad. And this is after we cleaned it up. So the first thing we did was we did a little homework and we started, a traditional pollinator garden. There was mostly exotic plants sold by local commercial vendors. And it was a great start. To be honest, it was fine. We had wildlife in the yard. We had a lot of butterflies and some bees coming through. But as my education kind of evolved, I learned about native bees versus Western European honeybees or Africanized honeybees. And I began to wonder where all these other bees were. There's 4,000 native bees endemic to the United States. There's somewhere around, I think, 160 endemic to Los Angeles. But all I kept seeing was the same honeybees and things coming through. And I realized that the wildlife that I was seeing was actually quite limited. And my kids, they were still having this wonderful young experience of at least getting to see things and have that experience of things flying through the yard. But I began to go down the rabbit hole of learning about native plants. So these were my first big influences. And when I say my big influences, the people who taught me about endemic native plants to this region, there's a whole list of them, from Barbara Eisenstein, Carol Bornstein, my friends Eric Knudsen and Kelly Coyne, and my friend Nick Hummingbird. They were my educators in the plants of this ecosystem. But the big ideas that sort of created my kind of foundation for understanding in all this, David Quammen wrote an essay. David Quammen is one of the most respected science and nature writers alive. Spillover in 2012 is one of the most acclaimed. It's a very acclaimed book in general, but it's one of the definitive pieces on pandemics. In 1998, he published an article in Harper's Magazine entitled Planet of Weeds. And David Quammen's revelations about rampant invasion of exotic species and their inevitable impact on our indigenous systems, it made a huge impression on me. And in many ways started me on this journey, though I didn't really realize it. Back then I was a photographer. I actually made a small book based on his idea about my own family and their invasion into Idaho. And then next, of course, is the Certified Wildlife Habitat Program from the National Wildlife Federation. That was the first time I was like, oh, this gives me standards to shoot for. And then, but the person who I think offered the golden idea was Doug Tallamy. I'm sure you all know him, and if you don't, Nature's Best Hope is a really powerful, clear, set of marching orders for anybody to understand why it's so important for us to create habitat now, however you can do it, wherever you can do it. And Doug took a lot of complex ideas based on his own. He's an entomologist who studied the coevolution between plants and insects. And he actually just studied back in the East Coast, I think Connecticut and in New England, the relationship between native trees and non-native trees and how many insects were hosting on them, how many caterpillars. Because as we'll later see, the relationship between caterpillars as a fundamental protein for all other biodiversity in your region is essential. That the caterpillars are, and insects in general, leaf-eating insects, are the foundation for biodiversity in many, many ecosystems. And we'll break that down a little bit more. So those three kind of ideas were what gave me a strong base to work from. And so that's what these are the people who got me started. And then along the way, I read the work of Ben Vogt. He's a Nebraska, he's sort of so much more than, he's a writer and a landscape designer and thinker. And he works within the prairie movement. His book, A New Garden Ethic, is a really beautifully written piece of journalism and personal writing. And he came up with a phrase called cultivating gardens of Defy and compassion. And I think that is such a important way to look at what we're doing, because for hundreds of years in this country, we've been sold a bunch of nonsense about what a garden is and what our neighborhood should look like and what our yard should look like. And you have to be very defiant. You have to begin to dissolve that idea and to allow a whole new idea of what is beautiful. And what is beautiful is this juxtaposition of native plants that are put together to create habitat that invite it back in all the species that we've pushed out. Here in Los Angeles, we have somewhere around 98% exotic canopy, and we'll learn that that canopy has pushed out so much of the wildlife that we actually rely on and need to invite back in. And another writer who I love, she's out of Ireland, Mary Reynolds. She created We Are the Ark. She's a very successful landscape architect from Ireland who one day just woke up and realized everything she was doing was wrong, and that she was designing gardens that were strictly decorative and served no role in the lives of all the animals and the plants and the people ultimately around her. And you can read about her, you can follow We Are the Ark, but these are some pretty powerful thinkers that have helped me sort of shape my perspective on all this. So reconciliation ecology is what Doug Talmay sort of based his work on. And this term was created by a guy named Dr. Michael Rosenzweig in 2002. And reconciliation ecology is the science of inventing, establishing, and maintaining new habitats to conserve species diversity where people live, work, and play. And Rosenzweig's data stated that there's only 4% uncorrupted wild space left in the United States. Right? The other 96% has been disturbed or lost to cities, suburbs, farmland, and grazing. And therefore, this notion that somehow these national parks and all these places are going to hold nature together while we as a species just go off and do our thing no longer holds water. And it's a beautiful principle and a simple fact. 90% of all leaf-eating insects rely upon native plants for food. That is a number put together by Doug Talmay. An average pair of nesting birds consumes between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars per clutch per nursing season. Now, not even later when they go to hunt for themselves, just when they're raising their brood. So those are powerful ideas to then move forward from. At the same time, we're having a habitat loss and we're having catastrophic animal declines. 40%, 3 billion birds lost since 1970, roughly 29% of all species worldwide. And this is a study done by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology in 2019. 40% of all known insect species in serious decline. And this was by the Biological Conservation Journal. So, you know, and if you look at this picture of these two carpenter bees mating, it's not like they're not trying. Like, nature's doing its best, but we are robbing them of opportunities and places to maintain their numbers. So a lot of you know who are into native plants, you know these numbers, but let me just throw them at you anyway. There's 40 million acres of lawn in the US. Lawns consume up to 10 billion gallons of fresh water daily. 10 billion gallons of fresh water daily. They use 80 million pounds of pesticides a year. They use 90 million pounds of chemical fertilizers, and they're responsible for 5% of our carbon emissions from lawnmowers and leaf blowers. That's by the Deep Roots Project. The average American child uses their lawn 40 minutes a week. An adult uses the lawn 10 minutes a week. And of that, they use about maybe 50 to 20% of the actual lawn. So that tells you how much is actually wasted. So again, just fundamental building blocks for where we're headed. So where do we live? Here in Los Angeles, we live in the California coastal sage scrub chaparral. So that is our actual ecosystem that nurtures us. And that's made up of chaparral, sage scrub, oak woodland, a bunch of different ecosystems, but this is the general heading under which they occur. The thing about where we live is we live in a biodiversity hotspot. And I'm going to just read Wikipedia's definition of it. Bear with me. To qualify as a biodiversity hotspot, a region must meet two strict criteria. It must contain at least 0.5% or 1,500 species of vascular plants and endemics. It has to have lost at least 75% of its primary vegetation. Around the world, 36 areas qualify under this definition, and these sites support nearly 60% of the world's plant, bird, mammal, reptile, and amphibian species, with a very high share of those species as endemics, meaning they don't live anywhere else. And some of these hotspots support up to 15,000 endemic plant species, and some have lost up to 95% of their natural habitat. California is ranked first in the United States in mammal diversity, fourth in bird diversity, fifth in reptile diversity. It's also one of the top ranking states for a number of animal species at risk. And many of these species can be found in our chaparral. 40% of its plants in our chaparral are endemic. They don't exist anywhere else in the world. So we all find ourselves living in the grace of this very imperiled set of ecosystems. So while the work that we're doing, and if you want to understand this map, you're looking at this big sort of reddish brown region. This is shared taxonomy. The green, shared taxonomy, yellow. But as we get into California, you see we get more and more isolated. And down here where we are, we're hyper isolated. So when our plants and animals go, they're gone for good. There's nowhere else to support them. So, but it doesn't really matter. All of these places are biodiverse. All of these places are gems. And no matter where you live in the world, we're all, I think, being tasked with the same mission. So, islands are where species go to die. It's a great quote by David Quammen. Species declines in the US fall squarely at the feet of habitat loss. We're cutting up the breeding and feeding grounds of species. No matter how large they might seem to us, it's a surefire way to terminate the species for good. And over time, the lowered populations, they can't survive natural downturns and disasters like fires and drought and other variables. They doom species to failure if they can't move about and breed and feed and do all those things. this is a very small section of Los Angeles. This is just Northeast Los Angeles, and you can see how chopped up it is. You know, we've got the beginning of the San Gabriel's up here. We've got the Arroyo. We've got Debs Park down here. We've got a little bit of green in Mount Washington, and the rest is all potential wilderness. And the only thing stopping it from being wilderness is us, because that's us. We've broken it all up. And the goal, the mission, is to inspire as many people as possible to retrofit and create bridges all through here by using native plants to create habitat in your yard and arc these species back so that they're not just moving through islands, they're moving through islands with corridors. There are giant wilderness corridor projects in effect, but every yard has the potential to create an interlocking wilderness corridor. So for example, here's a perfect example of fragmentation in effect. This black bear, this brown black bear has been coming down and getting stuck in Eagle Rock. This is literally like 2 blocks that way, which is kind of fun. I'm pretty excited about it. But this bear, and possibly another one with a cub, I'm not really sure how it all worked out, came down the Arroyo, came down through the Arroyo Seco, and then got stuck on this side of the 134. Eventually, I assume, unless it's found a job and it's working down here in Eagle Rock, it made its way back, but fragmentation makes it very hard for species to get where they have to go to keep their numbers strong and healthy. So once I started working with native plants, one of the first things I planted was a Cleveland sage. I'm a photographer, and I took a photograph of this bee, and I didn't know what I was looking at, but I was totally enthralled with the way that it accessed the nectar and the pollen. And I just thought it was a beautiful animal. It's a Longhorn Summer Bee. It's a digger bee. No, actually, yeah, it's a digger bee. And this was the first native bee that I really understood was visiting our garden. And that lit a pretty big fire in me. This is my front yard now. So big change, obviously, from that 12 by 25 chunk of dead sod that graced my property. And it is by no means how a native habitat would occur in nature. I have brought, it's a kind of a testing ground for me, and it goes from super hot full sun right here into part shade into full shade. This back area right here kind of functions like a somewhat traditional oak woodland, although it's under junipers that offer a lot of acid to the soil, so it's challenging. It's kind of like my demonstration garden. I like it that way just because I'm a collector and I don't know, I like to see what'll grow there. But the other thing is that plant diversity, especially flower diversity, amplifies biodiversity. And the more flowers, the more plants you can have functioning as both for the pollinators, but also as hosts, also offering up seed heads for birds, berries for birds, cover for all kinds of reptiles, mammals, birds, and other animals. The greater diversity you have, the greater biodiversity you will support. So I kind of have a rough list of what I've seen in here. Obviously, I'm not sitting around with my camera every day. But since we got rid of the sod, and I will say that there were earthworms under the sod. But since this garden was installed, I've recorded towhees, wrens, hummingbirds, bush tits, warblers, digger bees, leafcutter bees, carpenter bees, bumblebees, European honeybees, feral honeybees, whichever, alligator lizards, western fence lizards, bush katydid, shorthorn grasshopper, morning cloak butterfly, skipper painted ladies, hair streaks, monarchs, and peacock. I'd have no idea what the hell the peacock was doing there, but we came home a couple of weeks ago and there was a peacock in the garden. I don't know what that was about. This is our backyard. By the way, this is all California fescues, and currently most of that is dead, thanks to our new dog. Same deal, we have a short list. The one thing that we've discovered back here that's been kind of magical for me and the kids is the slender salamanders, which I'm sure most of you are aware of. They live way underground, they're lungless, and when it gets cold and wet, they come up. And so this obviously was a big, dry, dead seeming space. We planted this toy on, and there's a two different kinds of currant growing under there, and black sage and hummingbird sage here. And as the toyon was growing, I just threw a couple dead logs under there, and they have become habitat for salamanders and some of the other things that I found back here that we have a lot of experiences with are the scrub jays, lesser goldfinches, house finches, red-shouldered hawks, Cooper's hawks, towhees, wrens, Townsend's warbler, orange-crowned warblers, ruby-crowned kinglets, yellow-rumped warblers, bluebirds, hummingbirds, bush tits, digger bees, leafcutter bees, carpenter bees, bumblebees, alligator lizards, western fence lizards, bush-katydid, shorthorn grasshopper, morning cloak butterfly, skipper's painted ladies, hair streaks, sulfur butterflies, monarchs, fritillary skunks, raccoons, opossums, and a ground squirrel that's just moved in, which should be interesting. So obviously this is a much more biodiverse place, and I want to make sure that you remember that I don't live in a rural area. This is my house. This is 6-lane Colorado Boulevard. So it's amazing what's possible with these very simple transitions to your space. So there's a lot of things that happen when you create a habitat garden. And I want to use the visitors to our garden as a way to understand the elements that you're sort of juggling when you transition your space into habitat. Obviously, morning cloak butterflies on tansy leaf phacelia, that's an important pollen for them. Tansy leaf phacelia is a wildflower that does an enormous amount of heavy lifting and is a wonderful pollinator plant. But when you create a habitat garden and you let your leaf litter lie and you create that rich humus that has all that interesting microbiology happening and that healthy topsoil, other things happen. And they're things that you have no idea, and certainly I had no ability to plan for. This is cool. I mean, this is red. This is a red-shouldered hawk. This is a young hawk that learned to hunt in our yard. 80% of all hawks die within the first year of their life. Hunting is very hard, and most of them starve. This hawk would come into our yard and make completely useless passes. These are ground feeders. So some hawks, like peregrine falcons or Cooper's hawks, they're aerial feeders. They have a slightly longer claw in the middle, like a fielder's mitt, and they can snag birds out of the air. Red-tailed hawks, red-shouldered hawks, these hawks are ground feeders. So this young hawk would come into our yard and never get anything. And one day it just landed on this branch here, about 18 inches off the ground. And she just stood there. I don't know how to sex hawks. If anyone does, let me know. And I have a bunch of photographs of, I'm going to call it her, jumping around, digging in the dirt like a chicken or like a towhee would. And then eating bugs. It was eating bugs. And I since learned from Scott over at Wild Wings Ecology that young hawks, especially the ground feeders, this is how they get their protein. If they can't survive, if they're not having any success hunting, they'll eat beetles and they'll eat worms and all of those things that can only live in healthy soil. So when you let your leaf litter fall, when you create that humus and that beautiful layer of topsoil, you're doing so many things, and we'll talk about all this, but one of the things you're doing is creating an enormous amount of life. You're creating the possibility for your plants to live happily and healthily, but you're also creating a powerful mycorrhizal condition, microbiological condition, and an opportunity for all kinds of foraging birds, big birds and little birds, to eat. This is a metallic sweat bee, a green metallic sweat bee on an Eriogonum. And native bees do as much pollinating as honeybees. They're huge heavy lifters in our agricultural industries. But because they don't colonize the way honeybees do, most people don't give them much credit. They don't give them much, they don't pay much attention to them. But they only fly about a third, half to a third as far as a honeybee can fly. So they need habitat. So when you leave the ground open, when you create, nesting opportunities and board wood and all those kinds of things for native bees, you are helping yourself. You're helping yourself. You're adding, you're amplifying opportunities for the agricultural industries. You're amplifying opportunities for pollination of private gardens, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And when you add water, which I think is essential, especially here in Southern California, to any habitat garden, you are providing a really valuable asset for all migratory and resident birds, as well as bees and as well as butterflies. So soil, bare soil or other nesting capabilities for native bees, as well as local pollinators, water, and obviously wildflowers. The beautiful thing about the wildflowers is also they deadhead. And so they offer a whole other value once they're done blossoming. Here's some wild ones. My kids love the California fuchsia. It's like honeysuckle, real sweet at the back. And then they just rip up the lawn all day. Really, that's all that happens here, is a lot of lawn destruction. I'm going to tell you a few more stories. This is Coop. Coop also learned to hunt in our yard. And there's a couple Cooper's hawks that come through and hunt in the yard every few days. One day we came out, and I love the stink eye. That's just the best stink eye right there. And my kids were like, Dad, there's a head. There's a head on the sidewalk. And I went out, and sure enough, there's a little rat head. And we looked up, and there was Coop eating a rat. So when you create habitat, you get a little help with some of the less wanted fauna. This is an alligator lizard out on a rock on my parking strip under the Clarkia. So we planted a lot of grasses, a lot of bunch grasses, and a lot of wildflowers out there on our parking strip. And every spring, as that blossoms, the lizards kind of move out onto the strip because there's a lot of food opportunity for them. This is a bush tit, very small bird with a little song like a chime, and it moves through in a little flock. And it'll move through from one end of our yard to the other, working all the plants as it comes through, cleaning all the pests off your plants, especially in the spring when you have all that new growth. It's a little vulnerable. The plant's working really hard to blossom. It sometimes is a little more vulnerable to aphids and things like that. And the bush tits come through and they work that. This is one of the coolest things that I've ever found, which is Longhorn Summer Bee males. They don't have a lot of use back home. And they'll go out and feed, and as the sun comes down, they'll just clamp on. This is onto a Cleveland sage. They'll just clamp on and they'll sleep for the night. I think that's pretty cool. And then in the morning, when the sun comes up and warms them up, they take off. These two, I took a picture, I uploaded it to iNaturalist. No one has any idea. If anybody has any idea what those are, I don't know. They're in my yard though. So the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles has the BioScan Biodiversity Project. It was the biggest urban biodiversity study of flying insects of its kind anywhere in the world. They did 80 sites. They collected 1,872 samples, 500 plus species identified, and 47 new species discovered. And we'll talk about that in 1 minute. The one statistic that I got from Lisa Gonzalez, I tried to follow up and get some more, but native and water appropriate yards, meaning yards that use native plants and or plant species that were correct for where we live, had 30 to 50% more biodiversity than traditional gardens utilizing exotic plants. And that only relates to flying insects. Really tropical gardens, completely false gardens, had almost no biodiversity, which does a very good job of proving Doug Talmay's point that insects co-evolve with plants. And so when you bring in false environments for your garden, you are pushing out the insects. And obviously this is a giant problem. And when you add in the appeal of the other insects that they have to birds, reptiles, mammals, as well as the beneficial impact on soil ecosystems, the increased biodiversity is profound. So just looking at that number of insects, you begin to realize how a native habitat amplifies everything as it moves outward. So from this bioscan study, they had a remarkable discovery: 30 new species of flies discovered in Los Angeles. This was published first in the site Zoo Taxa. And how does this relate to a habitat garden? Well, flies breed mostly in humus and compost and things like that. So if you have a neat pinprick garden, if you blow away all your topsoil and your leaf litter, you're not breeding flies. And why do flies matter? Why should you give a shit about flies? Well, let's look at hummingbirds alone. Everybody puts out the feeders with the sugar water. 6% of a hummingbird's diet consists of the nectar that we all like to feed them. The other 94% consists of flies. And in the morning here, I can watch hummingbirds go to the hummingbird sage and to the California fuchsia when it's blooming. But then I'll also watch them fly over the back, some of them where I have more humus and compost, and go up and down the edge of the jacaranda tree where the flies have found shelter, and they'll just feed. So a lot of times if you're watching a hummingbird, it'll go from your nectar flowers, and then you'll watch it in the air kind of moving up and down, and what it's eating is flies. So we need them. I'm going to quote Barbara Eisenstein here before we move into this next section, because this was something that Barbara said to me when we were having a conversation about her garden. And it's maybe common knowledge to a lot of you, but it really blew my mind when she laid it down. A garden comprised of only or even mostly native plants will provide little food or shelter for birds or insects if it's maintained using today's most common garden practices. Removing leaf litter and woody debris, using blowers, applying herbicides and insecticides, and heavily pruning trees and shrubs destroy habitat, regardless of plant selection. These common practices lead to a greater loss of biodiversity than plant provenance alone. And why this is important is because habitat gardens are gardens of defiant compassion. You have to put it all together. You have to put the things in play, and you have to back off. You got to back off. You got to let it create its own ecosystem and trust that it knows what it's doing. And yes, you step in and you tend it. You tend to it. You help it. You make the best shot of surviving. But Barbara was the first person to introduce this idea to me, and I've since, of course, come across it in the teachings of Nick Hummingbird and in Tending the Wild and in so many other places. This is, of course, for a lot of people, common knowledge. But I cannot tell you how many gardens I've seen where they're like, oh, they'll have native plants and they're just pruned and trimmed into, complacency. I mean, they've just been beaten into submission. So this is the Gardening for Biodiversity checklist. And obviously, we've already talked about native plants, clean water access, leaf litter, humus, water infiltration, healthy maintenance, human health and safety. And we'll talk about those really quick. I'll get through that and try and lay that groundwork. And then we'll move into some ways that this can translate into out of our backyards and into the inner city and underserved areas and places that all need to be under this umbrella for this to work. So Gardening for Biodiversity checklist: humus, overall soil health. So long-term, deep soil carbon storage comes about through the creation of humus, the result of relationships between actively growing plants, fungi, soil microbes, and other critters. in a matrix that includes mineral, soil, and organic material. Leaf blowers destroy humus, kill off vital insects nesting living in the leaf litter, and rob the soil of its capacity to sequester carbon. This process, humification, builds topsoil while storing carbon in a stale form that can stay put for hundreds of years. Topsoil, creating humus, leaving your leaf litter, doesn't just provide a powerful engine for life, it stores carbon. It's one of the best ways we have of storing carbon. And amplify that out against 40 million acres of lawns and growing every day, and our power to do good becomes clear. Water infiltration. So by leaving your leaf litter and creating a topsoil, you allow leaf litter to compost in situ, creates a very absorbent, permeable layer of topsoil that does a powerful job of absorbing water. It reduces runoff, it fights erosion. Bioswales and rain garden concepts increase a site's ability to do that. But just having topsoil, just using the fundamental habitat garden concept of allowing your leaf litter to stay and allowing your topsoil to build also infiltrates water. Healthy maintenance practices. Lawns consume up to 10 billion gallons of water a day. They use 80 million pounds of pesticides. We already talked about all this. 90 million pounds of chemical fertilizers are responsible for our carbon emissions. A native habitat garden costs approximately 1/3 to 1/4 the cost of a traditional lawn. So healthy maintenance for a native habitat garden, there is maintenance, but it's nothing compared to the horrific damage we do with our standard practices. Human health and safety. This is my kids wandering in the hills right above our house with my wife. Studies now conclusively show that children who grow up in biodiverse ecosystems have less susceptibility to disease, and it's due to the microbial benefits provided by a biodiverse setting. People who spend time in biodiverse settings have lower rates of anxiety and depression. And various studies conclude that interacting with complex natural ecosystems, AKA not lawns or heavily manicured recreational equipment, promotes better mental health. This is from the publication Science Advances in 2019. There's also a study, and this is not peer reviewed yet, that biodiverse green space might have a tendency to reduce crime. Still under peer review, but evidence is mounting that biodiverse green space reduces violent crime. Basically, it chills people out, it makes you happier, and it makes you tougher. It's a win-win. So great habitat gardens are like any great gardens. They're only much, much smarter. Those gardens span from the West Coast to the East Coast. These are all different versions of habitat gardens that can be found. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about those because I want to talk about now, I think we've established a fairly good case for why habitat gardens, why gardening for biodiversity is just the place to go, to shoot for before you do anything else. It covers so many important arenas of concern. Urban rooftop gardens. So Alive Structures, that's the company that does these. This is out of Brooklyn, New York, believes that people disadvantaged by an unjust society deserve additional help to find work and improve their lives. They work with organizations like the Fortune Society, the Hope Program, organizations committed to environmental and economic justice. So the idea here is really to give people an opportunity at employment, as well as bringing biodiverse ecosystems into even the most difficult urban environments. And I love this idea. Food security. So this is Duran Chavez. Duran Chavez started his career in community advocacy, first as a volunteer, then an employee of the Black History Museum. In 2009, Chavez launched the Richmond Noir Market. It's in Virginia, a Saturday farmers market targeting low-income communities. Pictured here is his resiliency garden, in which the garden activist transformed a vacant lot outside the Institute for Contemporary Art in Richmond, Virginia, to highlight issues of food security and the importance of Black and brown community gardens. It featured dozens of edible beds, but it also featured, it was ringed with pollinator and native plants. And in a conversation with Duran, Duran said native plants are essential for successful food gardens and farms. Native plants for soil health, pollinator habitat, and overall biodiversity is a good thing. It is a good thing. The reason I bring this up is because I think a lot of times the conversation gets bifurcated between edibles and native plants. And the actual fact is that if you surround your edible garden, no matter how big or small, with local native plants, you are going to amplify your yield because native plants bring in a greater diversity of bees. One study, and I don't have it written down here, but it was sent to me on Instagram a little while ago. It concluded that they had 15 to 30% greater yield. Gardens that didn't use fertilizers and things like that, but ringed their edible sections with native plants. This is a quote from Janet Valenzuela. She's a community organizer of EYCEJ. It's Eastside Communities for Environmental Justice. And I'm just going to read it. I hope you don't mind. The use of native plants in low-income neighborhoods is a practical way to connect people to the outdoors and to the plants that once thrived in abundance here. Having native gardens, green space, and sacred spaces that liberate us from harm, environmental threats, which is a big issue to communities, especially down on the 710 corridor, has a significant way of empowering community residents in a built environment. It allows for radical imagination for them to see what our environments can look like beyond industry and beyond environmental degradation. And they're doing really cool work. They're working with decentralized gardens up and down the 710 corridor, and they're bringing in native gardens and native plants and introducing them for indigenous history, indigenous culture, indigenous culinary and medicinal purposes, but also to amplify their gardens and their yields. Habitat where no dirt exists at all. This is just one idea. This is an artist in New York. This is Anna Gerchik. She created a thing called BirdLink. These are modular, completely scalable beds that you can build. She's done them in parking lots. She's done them right in the middle of the city. She's done them in courtyards. And the idea is to plant native plants and create bird, bee, and butterfly habitat. And they have an irrigation system that it can tap right into to take care of them. You know, the efficacy of this long-term, I don't really know yet. We don't know yet. But the idea is that a lot of people don't have yards. A lot of people don't have anything. And yet, native habitats can be introduced anywhere as soon as you crack your brain open and get unstuck. And what I love about this idea is she's unstuck. China gets it, we should too. Criticize China we may about many things and with many good reasons. However, they are racing to incentivize biodiversity, and we must incentivize biodiversity in this city, in this state, and in this country. A few being they eliminate rebates for exports of 553 products that had a high energy and resource consumption. They establish guaranteed funds, which require mining operators to deposit funds or ecological recovery, etc. They provide subsidies for forestry and ecological conservation projects. They establish funds for forest ecological benefit, compensation, grassland protection, subsidy and rewards, wetland. They're also building entire cities to infiltrate water. These are called sponge cities because they have a big issue with fresh water in China. So they're giant bioswales using native plants and water infiltration to amplify biodiversity and to keep water in the ground where we need it. This city is called the Forest City in Lisao, and they're building the city and they're bringing the natural landscape and the natural flora right into the structure. This is a quote from Chief Seattle. These are my kids, and they're right here on the hill, right over my house. And although this ecosystem is heavily under threat from invasives, it's still pretty intact. And one of my favorite things about walking on this hill is that they walk through and they identify plants, not because they learned about them up there, but because they learned about them in our garden. So if my only goal in life was to achieve a baseline empathy for the natural world where they live, that has begun. And it doesn't mean that my kids always love and are as excited about plants and animals as I am. They're not. But they're being surrounded by it and they're having an experience of it anyway. And this quote from Chief Seattle, it kind of comes across like a cliche, and yet it's so relevant to this work. And the quote is, teach your children what we have taught our children, that the earth is our mother. Whatever befalls the earth befalls the sons of earth. If men spit upon the ground, they spit upon themselves. And this we know. The earth does not belong to man. Man belongs to earth. This we know. All things are connected. Like the blood that unites one's family, all things are connected. And why that's valuable to me is when I first started working in the native plant movement, it seemed very much relegated to wealthy white people in nicer suburbs. And if we can't scale this out and make it adaptable and viable for everyone, we lose. This has to be for everybody. And so my hope from this talk is that we begin to see how it can be for everybody. It's absolutely possible. We just have to rethink how it applies and how to make it happen for everyone. If anybody wants any of those bioanalysis orgs and wants to support them, I will supply all that information later. So what do? We do inspiration, education, and transformation. I do outreach, building community gardens. We have a community garden down the street. And at the Eagle Rock Presbyterian Church, we're always looking for volunteers. There's a lot of weeding to go down there. I really failed on the weed side of it, but the garden's growing nonetheless. We do consultation to help anybody anywhere in the United States. We find someone for them if they're not here in our area. If they're in our area, you can show up and help crack their mind open on how they can create a habitat garden where they live. And we do real estate because I think in many ways, realtors, HOAs, developers, they're the front line of this in so many situations. And we help them. We create a realtor's plant guide so that instead of using, what we consider to be very harmful methods of flipping a property or establishing a new property, we give them a way to do it and a set of plants to use that are analogs for the plants they typically use. And that's it. That's the Wild Yards Project.
Wow, that's really right on target. It's a perfect mesh with what we're trying to do in CNPS. But you've been getting out there and working with a lot of people that I'm afraid we haven't gotten to yet. So congratulations.
Well, I come from film producing. So I'm shameless about calling people up.
So, do you have time for some questions?
Man, I can talk all night.
We have a couple questions to start off with. Two questions that are essentially the same question from Karen Suarez and Carolyn West. Karen asks, what do you recommend as a way to pressure city leaders to incentivize this way of living? And then Carolyn asks, is there any way to move cities and counties to require native plants in new and replaced landscapes? I've been asking this for a few years now, but have never seen any action towards this anywhere. Las Vegas sure needs this as nature replaced by important pine trees, etc.
Yeah, I'm not an authority on this, and there's been a lot of hand wringing even here in Southern California and in Los Angeles, where I think compared to a lot of cities, we're ahead of the curve. I think I think you have to show up. I think you have to go to, a lot of us go to the Eagle Rock Neighborhood Council, go to your city councils. I think the most important thing is to always go with a solution and an idea. The first time I ever spoke as the Wild Yards Project, we gave a talk and we showed up with 300 plants and we gave them away for free. And we gave people a little set of instructions with that plan. But I know that and maybe one of you can weigh in, but I believe the new LADWP Cash for Grass plan does focus on natives. So I do think there is leeway happening here. And I think in other states, you know, we're all up against developers, and you know, there's terrible things happening here in Glassell Park, in Hollywood. You know, there's just rampant development and destruction to the oak canopy and things like that. I hate to use this word, but it's a bit of a battle. But I think you have to show up with a plan. You have to offer something, and you have to show up often. I mean, there are good things happening. The awareness is certainly far greater than it was 10 years ago. But I do think education is key. I do think getting it into the school system. I've seen a lot of like greening programs at schools where it's a third party that comes in on weekends, and it's not the kids. And I think the kids have to participate in this. I think you have to, you know, you have to brainwash them a little bit. They have to participate and see what happens when you create a biodiverse environment. I mean, I can circle back to this because there are a lot of initiatives happening here in Los Angeles. There's a big biodiversity sort of element happening at City Hall now. Isaac Brown from UCLA and has his own company, and he's, you know, he's a voice that's very much heard over there. But and there are HOAs. Theodore Payne has now worked with 2 HOAs that have done native plant programs on their new property, their new developments. So I think citing the wins, showing those wins, and bringing those other people, like I've now gone up before our board several times with presentations, and the listening is certainly greater than it was, but you have to show up. I don't think there's any, you know, silver bullet.
Somebody asked specifically about which homeowner associations on your radar have done large native plant installations.
Oh, I would have to, I just got one. I'm going to cheat right now and look up Erin Johnson from Theodore Payne, because she sent me, they loved it. This is something that that Erin and Tim did over there. I'm sorry, this is so not cool of me, but I don't have the name of it. If you reach out to Erin, there is Marshall Villas. So Marshall Villas is one that did it, and now there's another one that's inquired. I was gonna add those pictures in here, but I didn't have time. Getting to HOAs, the reason that I put one of the arguments I put in here is this, the things that you hit. One of the reasons, I'm gonna keep interrupting myself until I land this plane. China is designing for biodiversity, probably not because they give a damn about animals, but they understand that when you design for biodiversity, you deal with resource management, you deal with water, you deal with carbon sequestration, and those are all like pay me now or pay me much more later issues. So what's important is that people understand that when you garden for biodiversity, you're not talking about xeriscaping, you're not talking about drought tolerant, you're not talking about pollinator. All of those things fall well under the umbrella of gardening for biodiversity, and so much more. It's just a smart business model. And I think you have to present it to all these entities as a business model. And everyone needs to be looking at the long-term costs of maintaining their site, whether it's a city, an HOA, an apartment, whatever that is. And so that's kind of why I put this presentation together, because this makes powerful economic sense, especially when you look at the cost of undoing catastrophic damage from floods, fires, and all of those things. And if anyone wants to follow up with me through the Wild Yards Project, they can email me at wildyardsproject@gmail.com, and I will send you the information we just talked about. I meant to create there's 2 things I forgot, which is the HOA thing and a list of all of these entities that I just named.
Great, thank you, David. One person is specifically wondering about how they would find help for a native plant garden. They have one, but they need a little physical help. So I would add to that, probably because a lot of landscape workers aren't necessarily trained in how to care for native plants, and they might
Right.
need some more specific care than your typical garden.
Right. Maintenance people are always highly sought after, and I have a list of them. It hasn't been updated. I do have a list of people on my, if you go to the Wild Yards Project, Get Planting, there is a list of people who do the work. And again, it hasn't been updated, and there are so many more people doing it, and there's a lot of people who drop out. It's kind of like hairdressers. You ever notice that? Garden and maintenance people, they come and go. You have a good hairdresser, it lasts for like 2 years, and then where do they go? So I have a list there. If someone, again, if you fire a note off to me through Instagram, I will shout it out and get names of people. I have a pretty good list of people, though, if you're in Southern California. And I have a fixed list of the whole United States on the Wild Yards Project website.
Our next question from MJT. How do you recommend planting to realtors who usually want an immediate effect when many natives take a long time to grow and establish well?
Sure. Do less and do it better. I give a talk to realtors, as I said in this, and I have a list of analog plants for them. There's a lot of things they can do. You can stick deer grass in where you would stick fountain grass. You can stick toyon where you'd stick, a podocarpus and things like that. I mean, it's actually not, I reject the idea that it's because their plants are bigger or look better. It's just what's available to them at a commercial nursery. And it's just because they've been doing it that way for, centuries, quite frankly, or at least decades. So giving them that list, I mean, I would say, again, it's be as proactive as you can. You can go to our site. I have a PDF that you can just download. That's the realtors planting list. And it helps them for like anything they would need to do to flip a property. But the most important thing that I would say to anybody doing that is to teach, to help realtors understand that most homeowners are overwhelmed. They have too much other stuff to do once they get into that house. So whatever you start with is the fundamental building block for most homeowners. And so get them started on the right foot. It doesn't cost you any more. It'll ultimately, I think, cost you less. And it's just better.
That's all the questions we have for the moment, unless anybody wants to drop any additional questions into the chat or the Q&A real quick.
You can look for a second. I realize I unplugged my light. I'll be right back. I'm just on the other side of the computer. I didn't run away.
Okay, I'll read you the next question then.
Okay.
How do you approach neighbors with leaf blowers? A very practical
man. It's a really good question. People who have kids, it's a little easier. The amount of respiratory infections and disease from leaf blowers is undeniable at this point. The amount of damage that they do is pretty undeniable. You can't force people. I think this is something that should have been legislated a long time ago, because it's like burning car tires. It's like someone just throws a burning car tire on your lawn and walks away twice a week. It's incredibly destructive. It's obviously incredibly destructive to the mycorrhizae and to your topsoil and humus, but it's also on a respiratory level, it's incredibly, incredibly destructive. Make flyers and walk around and put them on people's doors. I'm dead serious. Just put it out there for people, give them information. Most people don't know how dangerous they are. And the rates of respiratory illness in children, especially over the last 4 years, you can do with that what you will, has gone way up. So just give them the facts. The other thing is you can give an electric blower. I tell people, I say, like, you can blow your leaves, blow them into my garden. Just don't blow them out of it.
Related question, what about the bamboo-like grass that comes in from neighbors? So what about invasive plants that are encroaching into your yard from outside spaces?
explosives, kill it with fire. You know, I have at the church garden, I have probably 10 really noxious invasives just ripping through the garden all the time. And I'm like Bill Murray in Caddyshack with the gopher. I mean, my whole life is dedicated to trying to figure out how to undo what, you know, 40, 50 years of neglect, you know, created. I think you just have to stay on top of it on your own. I don't know. It depends on your relationship with your neighbors. I haven't found people to be incredibly receptive to my suggestions. I think, generally speaking, my whole idea with this talk and my whole idea in general is that it should be appealing to people. You know, it should excite them. It should fire up some part of their brain. And I would always try to find a way to excite people, not confront them. Not that there's always a time and place for confrontation, but on an issue like this that's so transformative, I think you have to enroll people. I think you have to, you know, invite them into the tent and excite them with all of this, really. I feel like I dodged your question.
I have another question that is really related to the first question about, you know, how do we get cities and counties to support this? But this person is specifically wondering about planting natives along our freeway, which I'm guessing is like I think that's a Caltrans thing, but you can correct me or anyone else can correct me if you have any additional or different thoughts on that, on freeways in particular.
I think a couple other people on this conversation have had pretty big experience with Caltrans. I know that my partner, Chloe Renee Ziegler, went, and Lisa Novick, who was the head of outreach for Theodore Payne. And she now is in France. She fled. No, Nick got a grant. But they both worked with Caltrans. The big issue for Caltrans is like, do whatever you want, we're not maintaining it. And as you know, because of issues with homelessness and fire, they've actually been cutting back a lot of the native canopy along the freeways and the exits, on ramps and off ramps. But they'll also say like, oh, if you want to spread wildflower seeds, like go ahead, we're not going to stop you. At the same time, I don't have a ton of experience with them. And other people, some who might be listening here right now, I think do. I know Chloe does. They're not like horrible people. It's just in all of these cases, whether it's a city, whether it's a state, whether it's a community garden, putting plants in the ground is easy. Maintaining them is the work, and getting a loyal and disciplined crew of people to sign on for that. And that's why when I do consultation, I'm all for helping people with maintenance, but the goal here really, and I'm not talking about like freeways and things like that, but in general, the goal here is for us to become stewards of the land and to begin to know where we live, like really know where we live. Actually, Barbara said something beautiful to me once, which was, she said, I wanted to know California. And so I started growing California plants. And it's, of course, so much bigger than that, because you begin to know California plants and animals and ecosystems, and it's a deep, soulful dive. But that dive only occurs if you get your hands dirty. So again, it's get your hands dirty, see what they'll let you do, and then ask yourself if you're willing to maintain it. I know if you're doing Toyon and Laurel Sumac and some of those long-term gains along the off-ramps and on-ramps, you might live to see the heartbreak of watching them come through those big trimmers and just hack it all down. At the same time, I've seen tons of places where people have put arroyo lupin and bunch grasses, nodding needlegrass and California poppies and things like that to great success.
That was a great answer. Thank you. One more question, actually two more here. As a buyer for a native plant nursery, I'm having trouble with supply of plants. Does Wild Yards produce native plants?
No, I don't. And it's funny you asked me that. The short answer is no. I know people who are. I know people who are propagating plants. Where are you and where are you looking? If you want to send me who you're looking for. I do know that inventory has been really low. And that's a good thing. I mean, it's a good thing. It's people are, certainly in this area, there's a lot more people buying native plants.
Last question here. Has anybody thought about putting a square sign for cell phones on native gardens so people can copy or use the plants they like for a start? And I think that person probably means a QR code, so something that you could scan with your phone that would then give you a lot of information about the garden.
Well, funny you should ask. One of my fantasies, I have a template for an app that would do just that. And so we've built the template for the app. When I first started doing this, the first thing I thought of was an app, so that, you know, because there's a couple things. One is this is all local knowledge, right? Like you can't give people like a cookie cutter template and say, put these plants there, you'll be fine. Like, as we all know, those of us who do native plant horticulture, they're hyper specific. And you could put 3 different plants in 3 different places in your yard and have 3 completely different results. So using a nearby garden as an educational tool to me seems paramount. The first thing I did, just because of, you know, I like to talk to people, I just went around and met as many people as I could and tried to figure out what they were doing. And then I stole from the best, who still do it better than me. But I have a template for an app, and you know, they're very expensive to launch. So if there's anybody with a lot of money out there who wants to come and help fund the Wild Yards project, let's get it out there. But that, I think that is a key tool. And you know, calscape.org is a phenomenal tool. And you could combine calscape.org, if you're talking about using this in California, with a tool like, picture this. And that'll tell you what the plant is. And then you could go on to calscape.org, enter that plant name under advanced search, and it'll tell you exactly about that plant. It'll tell you what region it's endemic to. It'll tell you all of the pollinators and birds, bees, and butterflies that like it, and the conditions it likes to grow in. So right now you kind of have to, you know, use a couple tools, I think, to narrow it down if you're just starting out. But and I would also, you know, go to Theodore Payne, go to it changed its name? Is it now, Cliff? It's the California Botanic Garden.
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. I go to some of those places and just walk around, you know, and you'll learn a ton. But looking at, you know, it's the beauty of this. My favorite part of all this, on a real like micro level, is just getting to know your yard and getting to know the sunny and the shady spots and the dry spots and the slightly more, you know, and all this sounds like, you know, oh God, it's overwhelming, but it's not. It's just a matter of paying attention. So if you're walking around and you're in a sunny, you walk down a street and you see a cool plant and it's in a sunny spot and you're like, oh, I kind of have a spot like this, take a picture of it and see what, you know, see if you can find out what it is using many of the plant ID apps that are available, and then go on to calscape.org. And there's a couple other plant databases, I think, but Calscape is, I think, for California, I think it's hard to beat. And I don't know if you guys agree with me or not. And it'll teach you. It'll tell you the sun it likes, the soil it likes. It'll tell you who it gets along with, what other plant communities it likes to be around. That's one way to do it. The other thing to do is to go on Instagram and get involved with the native plant community and just ask questions. You can join the Wild Yards group on Facebook. You can join it on Instagram, and you can take pictures and ask questions. Also, the California Native Plant Society it's crazy. Like, people do amazing. People are like, oh, I took a picture of this thing that I found at, you know, 10,000 feet. It was growing, and they're like, oh, that's like, I don't even, the aggregate mind hive of the California Native Plant Society is a formidable thing, and I would take advantage of it.
This all reminds me, I should have mentioned in the at the beginning, to remind people that this week is the official California State Native Plant Week. And as part of that, CNPS, the state office out of Sacramento, has put up every day they've been adding additional virtual 360 garden tours
Yeah,
online.
they're so good.
And so if you want some ideas of what you might do in terms of just layout or some of the plants that you might use in your yard, I recommend you go to the state CNPS website, cnps.org, and look at their Native Plant Week section and check out some of those virtual garden tours. We were lucky to have them create one for our garden. So we're on there along with Naomi Fraga, who's one of our members, and Jesse Chang's one of his school gardens that he's worked on. So plus a lot of other really great gardens from around the state. So I highly recommend that.
I'm gonna chime in right here and say that CalScape is a CNPS project. You seem to wonder if we approved of it, and it's our project. It was donated by the developer to us.
Any other questions?
That's all the questions we have from the audience.
Okay, well, David, thank you very much for that talk. That was very helpful in a lot of details and a lot of inspirational ideas. So it fits in with what we want to see happen all over the state.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And I really like all of your work.